Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to the Monday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. A whole new week of episodes for you. We're so excited to bring them to you. We're starting off with Russ Kazmierczak. He is the one-man show behind Amazing Arizona Comics. And what is that, you might ask? If you have not heard of it, it is a mini comic series that comes out every month. Russ does the writing, Russ does the art, Russ does all of the design and printing, and he sends it to you or sells it to you if you're in person. And it's just an amazing story of how one independent creator put his passion into motion. And let's tell it now. This is Russ Kazmierczak. Russ, how you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me, Michael. I appreciate it.
We're excited to have you. I continue to use the royal we, even though it's just you and I. But it always feels like a team effort. My co-hosts are always with me spiritually, if not physically. So let's get started with a usual first question, as you may know from listening to our episodes, and that's how did you first discover comics?
Well, the first comics I ever read were the mini comics that came with Masters of the Universe and Superpowers action figures.
Mm,
So I didn't realize at the time how many comic book greats I was experiencing even then. I mean, those mini comics had the works of Bruce Timm, Alfredo Alcada, lettering by Stan Sakai. Larry Houston illustrated a few of the He-Man mini comics. And then on the DC side with Superpowers, I'm sure um, all of the standard house artists at that time, like Dick Giordano and Jose Luis Garcia, were probably involved in that work. So those stories really captured me. But I came into standard kind of full-sized comics when my dad worked for a moving company, and one of his clients, was downsizing. So he got to take home some of the periodicals this guy had.
mhm.
One box was a box of comics. The other box was a box of Playboy magazines. So my dad left one of those boxes at the foot of my bed that Saturday morning. If it were the Playboy box, I think I'd be on a different podcast. But it was
I'd say.
it was the box of comics. It was 49 issues, going kind of starting in the mid 80s and going into that early 90s. I think Eric Larson and David Michelinie's Amazing Spider-Man 347 was the top of the stack. Venom on the cover, holding that Spider-Man mask draped skull.
Yeah.
And I
The
was just,
Hamlet, you know.
yeah, yeah, the
The last poor
Shakespearean
Spider-Man.
I killed thee well or something he
Yeah,
says.
right.
Um, and I was just sucked in, man. I literally went to the Yellow Pages that week, looked up my local comic book store, rode my bike to the shop, and started buying the titles that were in that box. Just kind of kept reading. Michelinie's Spider-Man, Peter David's Hulk. Of course, I got into Batman with Alan Grant and Norm Brayfogle and Jim Aparo and Chuck Dixon. And I've just loved comics ever since.
We always like to ask as a follow-up whether you still have any of those originals, and I'll ask that both for the mini comics as well as that first box of 49.
I absolutely do. I have most of the He-Man mini comics and Superpowers mini comics. As for that original 49, my friends and I had our first, we didn't realize what it was at the time, but we had our first Comic-Con where in a buddy's bedroom, we like laid out our comics in front of us and started doing like trades and things like that. And among those first 49 comics was Incredible Hulk number 345, which was the end of that Peter David, Todd McFarlane arc.
Yep.
I didn't realize the potential value of that issue at the time. So I traded it with a buddy for a full set of Marvel trading cards, the second series.
Mhm.
So not sure if that was a lateral move
I mean,
by
at that
today's standards.
time, at that time, at least in the space that those cards took up in a geek like us, our brains, I think that would have been an even trade. Nowadays, maybe not as much.
Yeah, I didn't realize how forward thinking my friends were then. So that I know that's one of the original 49 no longer in my collection, and I'm sure there are others too that were kind of lost to the decades. But
Yeah.
That Amazing Spider-Man run for sure. That a lot of that Hulk run. Strange Tales Volume 2 that had Cloak and Dagger and Doctor Strange. Uh, that series was
Mhm.
almost in its entirety in that box, and that introduced me to Brett Blevin's work, Terry Austin Inks. So yeah, well, I just was immediately introduced to a lot of the greats right away, and those books kind of formulated my tastes in comics.
And from that, cauldron of comic book goodness, when did you start making comics or even think about making comics yourself?
I made comics as a kid. I drew my own little He-Man adventures, mimicking those mini comics. And then as I became an adolescent, I drew some, I guess what would be considered by today's standards, bootleg comics starring me as Robin. So I was in suburban Phoenix, West Phoenix, fighting, pickpockets and stuff in a Robin suit. So those were the very first prototypical comics I ever made. But as far as full-fledged small press and self-publishing, I was living in California going to college, and I was the editor of our school paper when I brought the at the time 3.5 inch floppy disk into the publications office for layout. And one of the layout guys was wearing a Batman t-shirt, and I was wearing a Batman t-shirt. So we like instantly connected, started hanging out, grabbing coffees, and he would draw scripts that I wrote. So we were self-publishing comics together as KO Comics, K the first letter of my last name, O the first letter of his last name. We figured KO was better than OK Comics. So I got top billing with KO. And we exhibited at San Diego and Ape in San Francisco, um, at our local Mile High Comics at the time in Garden Grove. When I
Mhm.
moved back to Phoenix, I wanted to continue self-publishing, so I ended up drawing stories myself. And that's kind of the journey I've been on ever since 2010 is writing and drawing and self-publishing my own superhero stories based right here in Phoenix. I'm not in them in a Robin suit anymore. These are original characters that I've created that kind of speak to different aspects of Arizona living. And it's been a blast.
It sounds like it, and looking over your website and some of your work, that it is just a really enjoyable, um, you know, story, or well, not story, really enjoyable, sort of a journey through kind
Oh,
of
thank you.
Arizona. And I like that it's local, and I like that it's contained, and have created your own characters. Although I think it would be funny if you continued to show up every now and then in a Robin costume, breaking the
In a
fourth
Tim Drake
wall.
run.
But so you call
I just
your
like having the R on my chest. I felt like
yeah,
R could stand for Russ too. So.
right. Yeah, of course it could. Yeah. Totally. And so you've been doing this creator-owned material under the banner of Amazing Arizona Comics, right?
That's right. Yep.
And so,
Sometimes I've used Karaoke Fanboy Press if
okay.
I'm publishing zines, fanzines, poetry chapbooks as well. But Amazing Arizona Comics is the flagship title and really the banner under which I self-publish, kind of like Detective Comics, DC,
Right.
that kind of, it's both the comic and the company kind of thing.
And was that basically yeah, so that was the first and now flagship title under whatever you want to call the publishing
Absolutely. Yeah.
shingle for Russ. Um, So, can you tell me how Amazing Arizona Comics, the entity, the actual series title, came about, and when you started putting that together?
Absolutely. Like I said, I lived in California for some college and career between 1997 and 2009. I grew up here in Phoenix, moved back in 2010, and was kind of, like I said, wanting to get into small press and self-publishing on my own without my friend's assistance, considering the distance between us. And he's so super talented, by the way. His name is Brent Otey, Otey. I would shout him out and encourage anybody to check him out on Instagram too. He was working on his own projects, so when I was thinking about something I might want to do, I'm a superhero guy, pretty tried and true. Um, and I didn't have any new ideas that I wanted to start over with until one night I was watching CNN here at home, and I saw our own Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio on the news talking about Arizona's role in the nationwide immigration controversy. We had a state bill at the time called SB 1070. It was kind of the show me your papers
Right.
bill that might be infamous to those paying attention to such things in the news. And just seeing uh, somebody that I was familiar with in local law enforcement, love him or hate him, um, on this nationwide platform, it got me thinking that if Commissioner Gordon were real, he would probably end up being a talking head on some of these nationwide shows. Like I could see Commissioner Gordon on Pierce Morgan or talking to Anderson Cooper about their unconventional ways for fighting super crime in Gotham City. And what's that signal on the police headquarters roof and stuff like that all about. So thinking about Arpaio in that role here in Phoenix, if superheroes really existed, surely he would try to recruit them. Because I don't know if you know, he had kind of this pseudo celebrity posse for a while with Steven Seagal and Lou Ferrigno. I think there's a really funny clip on YouTube you could find where Joe Arpaio and Steven Seagal are trying to bust like a cockfighting ring or something like that here in Phoenix. So weird stuff. And I just thought again, if superheroes existed, he would try to recruit them in the same way. So I created some, and that was kind of the the launching point or the catalyst for my stories. Is these young heroes are coming into powers, as happens in comics and superhero comics, and he's kind of swooping in, and they have to decide where they stand with him. And as I progressed self-publishing issues 1, 2, 3, by the time I got to like 6 or 7, I kind of left the Arpaio trope behind, and these characters took on lives of their own. Plus, he left office eventually, so I wasn't so dependent on that little trope. I was
Mhm.
able to spin things into its own direction. And to this day, I just watch the news, keep an eye on the headlines, and if there's anything really quirky that seems like, yeah, superheroes could be involved in that kind of thing, or maybe they were, and the news just didn't report it. Those are the kind of stories I like to tell in my comics, kind of loosely inspired by Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams' Hard Traveling Heroes run, where Denny and Neil were drawing from kind of socially relevant topics of their day and dropping Green Lantern and Green Arrow with their respective political views into the mix. That's kind of what I like to do, without being as politically slanted as all that. It's very kid friendly. I'm not making any bold statements one way or the other. I'm basically just presenting some issues that maybe kids would first experience in something like comics, as I remember, seeing things like, Speedy's, you know,
Reviews.
my ward is a junkie cover
Yeah.
and all,
Yeah.
and all that stuff. So um, that's still very much a comic for teens and younger, tweens, and I'm just trying to incorporate that mentality into my own work as far as can contemporary superhero comics be fun and have that spirit of adventure, but then also have that little bit of social relevance where you're not making a bold political statement, so you're isolating half of your potential audience, but you're still presenting something in a different way, so folks are thinking about it when they're done reading the book.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And it's something I think that is not done very much by mainstream comics anymore, because I think with good reason, a lot of the mainstream is kind of gun shy to take on anything that even has a whiff of sort of controversy or politics to it. But yeah, I totally agree that, this is a great way to, done right, which I think you're doing, marry the real world issues with a more entertaining, familiar sort of anchor, which is sort of the superhero genre. So it really sounds like almost a plain sight idea. Like why hasn't someone, grabbed this before, and yet you sort of make it your own, and especially where it's concentrating on, more Arizona issues, although, you dabble here and there with, national type stuff that obviously happens in Arizona.
Yeah, in recent years, the lens has kind of pulled back a bit, and we're looking at more nationwide issues. For example, in one of my latest issues, number 51, uh, some of my superheroes tackle the homeless crisis. There's a superhero supervillain brawl. They inadvertently crash through a homeless camp, and my hero Sam Brero feels so bad about destroying this unhoused guy's tent that he tries to kind of rehabilitate him and get him back on his feet. And it's not as easy as he thinks it is, of course. It's a very complicated dynamic. Um, and although the issue takes place, that story takes place here in Phoenix, I think that's something that could be happening in any city across the country right now. Um, Stan Lee was doing it in Marvel Comics in the 60s. Everything took place in New York, and yet you could read a Marvel comic anywhere around the world and instantly get what was going on without being super familiar with the setting. Eric Larson's doing a lot in Savage Dragon too. I mean, he brings in these caricatures of political figures. I know there was some weird, like monstrous, was it Osama bin Laden years ago? He had some kind of
Yeah.
weird zombified, risen from the grave Osama bin Laden, and he's had all the presidential candidates appear over the past few years. And it takes place in Chicago, and now I think Malcolm and his family live in San Francisco or something like that. And again, even though it's regional, once you kind of just establish that, that doesn't necessarily mean somebody from anywhere else in the world couldn't enjoy those comics. So that's kind of my hope, is having Arizona in the title isn't necessarily prohibitive to people, but more of an inspiration to check out what's going on maybe in another part of the country, and realizing that it's pretty similar to where they live too. It's hotter, but it's otherwise pretty similar to where they live too.
Of course, of course. It's interesting you bring up Savage Dragon because I was, looking through all this stuff. I was thinking of that as maybe a little bit of a model. I don't know how much it just sort of, you ended up naturally kind of paralleling it, but in terms of a long-term um, title and story where you're taking and so is Eric sort of taking contemporary issues and sort of tackling them on an issue by issue basis, but yet there's still that kind of long-term trajectory in terms of a story. I think it's really fascinating, and it's a really great way to kind of have your cake and eat it too, so to speak, be able
Absolutely,
to,
yeah.
have this grander narrative, and but also be able to kind of exist in time in a certain respect. I wanted to ask about your the format, right? So interestingly enough, so it's mini comics.
It is.
And this is something, this was your first foray
Yep.
into comics, right? From He-Man and some of the toy lines where they were giving these away. Um, what appeals to you about that format? And is this something that you think is underutilized in the industry?
I do think it's underutilized, especially in the DIY format through which I self-publish. This is just regular printer paper folded in half. Um, I've played with different paper stocks in the past, but what I love about this is the approachability and the practicality of when I'm talking to younger artists that have no idea where to start in making their own comics. I just show them this and say, if you can get to a FedEx Kinko's or a UPS store with your comics on a flash drive, you could self-publish as well. It really is that easy nowadays. And it really has been for a while. The DIY punk zines of the 80s were in this format too. So I love that. I love that feeling of, if my boss takes a long lunch, I might be able to print 30 issues real quick here at work. That kind of subversive element to that. But then also, like I said, the fact that there's nothing really precious about this. You're not going to bag and board this. You're going to fold it up. You're going to put it in your back pocket. You're going to read it on the go, maybe, or be pleasantly surprised that you find it in your backpack later or something and then read it. Um, I think bags and boards are it's like some of the worst thing. I think that's the worst invention ever introduced in the comics culture because it kind of locks that story in forever. Like
Mm.
the covers are awesome and I love looking at covers, but like the real meat and potatoes of what comics are is inside. And that barrier in the guise of collectability to me just kind of undercuts comics' full potential. So again, having something like this demands that you open it, read it, and again, maybe make one of your own because it could be this easy. There's a manga element to this too, where it is kind of smaller, closer to a digest size. And I just think the kids today, not to sound like a super old man, but the kids today love that portability and that density. So yeah, those are all my thoughts going into this kind of thing. It's affordable. It's portable. It does, like you say, celebrate the fact that comics can be any size, like those mini comics where they came with those toys. Man, the talent in those comics, the world building that they accomplished, it just proves that size doesn't matter.
That's for sure. And it sounds like accessibility above all else is really the goal here. And, being able to easily make them, but also easily distribute them and yeah, not having that extra collectability. Um, it can be an onus, I guess.
Mhm.
And I think that's what you were getting at. There is a real tension in comics, particularly as a storytelling medium versus mostly not, versus instead of sort of in a
A
friendly
collectible.
tension with a collectible, right?
Yeah,
And so, baseball cards didn't have that because baseball cards aren't telling a story. And like, I'm just going back to some sort of the older kind of collectible things like coins, stamps, now I'm dating myself. This is really old stuff. But I mean, all of those kind of things until really comics came along were, they weren't a storytelling medium. They were a physical object that was collectible. And now all of a sudden you have comics that are supposed to be both, but
mhm,
one gets in the way of the other. And
totally.
it's yeah, if you really want people to experience the story, experience the characters, and have an emotional reaction, they need to read it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's an investment in one of two ways. It's either a financial investment, which is a gamble, or it can be an emotional investment. And I think prioritizing the emotional investment is what creates long-term sales.
Hmm.
So that certainly speaks to my faithfulness to this stuff. When I read those first 49 issues and then the mini comics before that, man, I just fell in love with these characters, the worlds they live in, the stories they told me, the lessons they taught me. And when I started bag and boarding, I realized not only does that take up precious room in these long boxes where there could be more comics, but um, yeah, it's just a barrier, a minimal one, but one that creates this kind of psychological preciousness where maybe I won't revisit these comics as often because heaven forbid I set one down on a wet ring where my glass was, or one of the corners gets dog-eared or something. And I've just come in the last few years, especially to the point where it's like, forget all that. I'm going to read the covers off these things, and I hope people do that with my comics too.
How long does it take to put together an issue of your mini comic?
If I have all, if my engine is firing at full potential, I could self-publish an issue in probably 2 months. Um, I shoot for quarterly, but if I can accomplish 2 months, 2 months time, that would be amazing. One year, I think it was 2016, I attempted monthly from May to December. It was my May December initiative, I called it, and I kind of accomplished it. If you consider a month, maybe 6 weeks. So um, I was close to that finish line. So I decided that maybe once every 8 weeks and ideal maybe quarterly would be a more ideal pace. And every stage takes about an hour, give or take. Thumbnailing um, just takes a couple days, kind of developing the story visually and narratively with notes and dialogue. This is my process, and then I'll pencil and ink traditionally on Bristol board, scan those inks and color digitally in Photoshop, letter format and print. So every step takes about an hour. Thumbnailing might take a day or two as I'm crafting the story kind of visually and narratively. Maybe more than a day or two, a couple days for sure, just kind of taking my raw thoughts and putting them on paper. And then when you get to the penciling and inking each page, penciling maybe an hour, inking an hour, I do that on Bristol board with lead and ink. I'll scan that artwork and color and letter digitally, each one of those steps potentially taking up to an hour each. And then, if my book has anywhere from 8 to 32 pages, depending on the story, kind of parse that out over the period of time, and that's about how long it would take. So not one for math, but each story kind of takes its own time, but I definitely like the consistency of quarterly.
Hmm, I get it. Um, Now, even though we've talked already about, the appeal of the mini comics, uh, and I think you're sort of dedicated to this going forward, is there any room on maybe a less frequent basis for a special or something to work in larger formats? Do you have any desire to do that, or is that just sort of that's not my game? I'm, dedicated to the smaller formats.
Oh, totally. I have done a few standard sized comics in the past, especially when I learned that specific comic book stores don't carry anything other than that size, essentially. Um, you know, Despite the affordability and the portability and all those ability words, legitimacy is another one. And
Mm.
I think that some shop owners look at this as maybe a little too novice, a little too amateur. And I can appreciate and understand that because they're running a business and they want to have quality product on their shelves. So I did publish a few standard sized comics a couple of years ago. I am looking in 2025. It's spinning one of my main characters out into his own series, or at least a one shot, and that would be published in a standard sized comic, to give that story its full due because it's overdue. And that's a goal coming up in the near future, actually. So I appreciate you asking that.
Sure. Do you like doing, or maybe I'll rephrase that, not do you like, but which out of, because you're a one man shop here, which out of all of the different disciplines that go into producing a comic do you enjoy the most? And which, I won't say that you dislike, but you maybe like the least, or that you would want to improve?
Well, I would say I enjoy the penciling the most and the inking the least. And I know that a lot of creators might feel the other way around about that. I know a lot of folks love the inking process and love the embellishment of the line and the tools that they use. By the time I get to inking, I've theoretically drawn that page. I'm on that page now for the third pass. I've thumbnailed it, I've penciled it, and now by the time when I get to the inking, I start to feel a little, I don't want to say bored, but like, all right, already with this page, let's just get it in the computer so I can color it. So one of the ways I overcome that kind of mental block is I don't ink linearly. I may pencil linearly, but I don't ink linearly. I'll start with the most exciting page I think I have. So that's often kind of in the middle, the climax of the story, maybe in the middle or toward the end of the second act. And then I'll build out to the first and last pages. And something else I think that does is presumably you get better every time you work. So if I'm inking my first and last pages last, and those are the reader's first and last impressions of my book, theoretically, those are the best impressions that they'll get because I'll be at the height of my powers at that time. I will have been inking the book, um, in its entirety by then. So to ink almost the first or the last page last guarantees that that could be the best page, and that's just my mentality and my approach in that. I do really want to focus and spend more time on inking here in the near future because I understand the value of it very much. If I worked digitally kind of exclusively, like I know a lot of folks do, the penciling and the inking phase may be one. It could be simply inking over blown up thumbnails. And I'm just too old school for that, unfortunately. So while I see what the economics of that as far as time goes, as long as I'm working with these primitive tools, I think this is the method I'll be following.
Now, I want to ask a little bit about story, not structure, but story building, because we talked already about that, a lot of the ideas in some of these issues are timely, um, not necessarily evergreen, but you also have, maybe a long-term narrative that you're working with. How do you figure out where the story, the overarching story is going? Is it more of a you kind of lay it out as you get there, or is there a more you know, more structured outlining that happens way beforehand? How much is sort of improvisational versus really planned out?
I try to establish my act structure first. So I present my characters with the challenge of the issue, complicate that challenge, and then try to solve it. If I can establish those beats right away, then I do leave some wiggle room for improvisation, like you say, with action and dialogue or subplots and character development, whatever kind of happens as I'm working out those acts. If something kind of just presents itself, I mean, not to sound really heady or kind of new agey about it, but sometimes the characters really speak to you, and something you thought was going to happen ends up going another way because the characters kind of make it so. And that comes in part with knowing what each character's motivation is in the story. If you're working with an ensemble cast like I do, um, it would be my hope that they don't all sound the same, that they each kind of have their own way of speaking, their own motivation within the story, their own take on the situation, and kind of exploiting that wherever I can helps to distinguish them and drive the point forward to the end. So I try to accomplish all of that in the thumbnailing because I'll write dialogue notes to myself on the side. Ultimately, I'll leave the final dialoguing to the letters phase. That's kind of Marvel methoding myself, where
Hmm.
I know somebody's saying something here, and I know it kind of has to go like this or that, but the the specific um, the specific words that they say, the actual dialogue, might not happen unless I have a really clever thing I want to include that I get in the notes on the side right away. Um, that won't happen until the lettering phase. At the point now with my storytelling, I really don't start penciling until I know how the story ends. I've made that mistake where I've started a story and I'm really excited about this particular scene that was kind of the inspiration or the catalyst for the whole thing. And I just have no idea what happens at the end. And I think a lot of people kind of stream of conscious work that way. It just doesn't work for me anymore. I really want to make sure there's a definitive the end, and it doesn't always have to be a happy ending or a quaint ending or a tidy one, but as long as there is this kind of definitive conclusion to the story where the reader's walking away with that smile on their face because it was fun or that cocked eyebrow because they're thinking about something, then that's a mission accomplished for me.
Now, this is an ongoing series for all intents and purposes. Uh, Speaking of endings, is there any altogether end in sight, or is it again taking a page maybe from Savage Dragon where it will just go until you decide, Okay, that's it.
Yes, probably that. What's different between my stories right now and Eric Larson's with Savage Dragon is he has this multi-generational thing happening now
Mhm.
where Savage Dragon's kid has kids and they're getting old enough where they may become the main protagonists of this book
Right.
sooner than later. So, not that Malcolm doesn't have a lot of life left in him, but man, it just seems like the sky's the limit for um, all of these kids that he has and who could be the Savage Dragon in any given month. My characters have kind of remained perpetually late teens, early 20s, despite the fact that the book's been in action now for 14 years. And what happened in issue one is very definitively 2010. And what's happening in issue 53 that I'll be working on soon is very definitively 2024. I guess the way I justify that is maybe they were in their late teens when it all started, and now they'd be kind of in their late 20s. And you wouldn't see significant age necessarily. Certainly, my drawing style and my growth as an artist has dictated that they look a little different, and maybe that could speak to their maturity. So we're kind of working in tandem in that way, my skills with their age. But yeah, at some point, I think I'm going to have to acknowledge that one of my characters is like 30 years old or something. And
Well, you're
even though I'm
working.
older than that, I don't know, you know, since I do really think about appealing to both like the 12-year-old and the 52-year-old, we see it in DC and Marvel all the time, especially with these new Absolute books that just came out. They're always trying to breathe new life into these characters, make them young and appealing and hip and cool. So, if my characters kind of cross that threshold of, well, what are their day jobs? And do they live in apartments or houses? Or what kind of car do they drive? All things I haven't really broached. Um, Once I get to that point, I'll have to really kind of evaluate, are those important stories to tell? Is that the kind of thing I want my readers to experience along with me? Or does there have to be this kind of reboot, refresh? And how do you address that when you want to have timely significance, but then also a timeless series. Uh, so yeah, maybe my book will reach out like a midlife crisis, and I'll figure that out.
I mean, yours sounds more like traditional comic book time, right?
Yeah,
Where what we're seeing in real time only takes place in a very small amount, and the era in which it takes place just kind of magically moves along. Um, again, to keep going back to the comparison with Savage Dragon, I mean, we've talked to Eric a couple times, and he set out to do this in real time, which is
yeah,
something I think for an ongoing that had never been done before. And I think he even feels a little bit of the constraints of, having committed to that. It's kind of a
sure,
difficult thing to do, although he's doing it, as well as it can be done in really, interesting ways. But yeah, I don't think anyone would, fault you for doing it the traditional way and having these characters. I mean, look at The Simpsons, for God's sakes. Uh,
that's
they
absolutely
they
right.
never age, and yet they're always contemporary.
Totally. Yep.
Do you ever see a time when you would either like to, or if they came to you, you would work with a traditional publisher on something, even if it's not, your baby, the mini comic series. Is that something that might appeal to you?
Oh, sure. I always have strands of fan fiction running through my imagination, and I play that make believe with, if a publishing house approached me and said, "Here's our catalog, pick the IP that you're most interested in," how obscure and bizarre would I get? Like, I'd love to do a the Greatest American Hero comic or the A Team comic. I actually feel like I have a really great the A Team meets the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles story that IDW could publish
I was
because I
going to
think
say,
they
are those
own.
licenses in the same place? It's
I
with
feel like when the
IDW?
A Team movie came out a couple years ago, what, 10 years ago, I think, more. Geez, that was an IDW book. They did some movie tie-ins or an adaptation or something. Uh, so yeah, I always kind of go off on these flights of fancy, but oftentimes I'll take some of those story ideas and just morph them into something my characters could experience ultimately. Because as much as I value all of those IPs and the stories and the characters, the comics, the TV shows I loved when I was a kid, when I think about the icons and my heroes in the industry like Stan and Jack Kirby, the Image guys like Eric Larson, Rob Liefeld and stuff, there always seemed to be this strident going out on our own and creating something that's ours. I think it's interesting that the trend seems to be if you're self-publishing comics and you've created your own characters, you always kind of evolve into this state where you're doing sketch covers, sketch cards, and maybe eventually bootlegs that are straight up licensed characters or kind of satire or
Hmm.
kind of archetypal characters that you could find the parallel pretty easily. If you're self-publishing and you're indie, you kind of go that way. Then the guys that are in the trenches of the industry working on these characters all the time end up kind of pursuing independent work. Like Mark Waid has gone and self-published his own titles with artists. And like I said, the Image guys, and there are just so many examples of Scott Snyder's, create your own properties, Mark Millar and his whole Millar universe, kind of following on the heels of his work on the Ultimates. So like I think it's a push and pull between you want to contribute to these mythologies that drew you in, but at the same time, you want to create your own and see if there's any viability there. So when people look at your work as a legacy, when you're long gone, they see both this originality and this, kind of nostalgia that speaks to where you came from and what you contributed.
Makes a lot of sense. Another sort of paradigm in the comic book world nowadays is crowdfunding. And there have been a lot of creators, both established creators as well as those just starting out, that have turned to places like Kickstarter and Zoop, and there's another one out there that I just am not at the tip of my tongue. Um,
Yeah.
have you thought about that as a distribution platform? And even if not, what do you think of those platforms and the more work that is getting out through those methods?
Well, I'll be very honest, and it might be a controversial thing to say, but when these platforms became popular, and again, I'm thinking 15 years ago at this point, right? Kickstarter would have been kind of really launching in the early 2010s, maybe earlier than that.
I feel
Um,
like that's about right. Yeah. Maybe
because I
it's
have done
2010
one.
itself.
Yeah, I did
Yeah.
do one in 2015, but prior to that, and that funded that May December initiative that I mentioned earlier, where I
Oh yeah,
self-published
right.
monthly. Um, but prior to that, my initial thoughts with those platforms were, why should I burden somebody else with funding my dream? Like, if I want to get this thing done, I'm going to find any means possible to get this thing done. But I've kind of come around to the fact that any means possible might be soliciting friends and a growing fan base for that help up front. As long as you deliver
Right.
and look at that as distribution, like you said, as much as funding, because there's certainly a lot of value in that. Then yeah, I'm all for it. And Kickstarter is probably one of the leading comic book publishers today. I mean, we always talk about Marvel, DC, Image, Dark Horse, but man, so many great comics are coming out of Kickstarter. My friend and mentor Dean Haspiel has been doing Kickstarter comics for the last 2 years. JMD Mateus has like a whole universe he's created
Yep.
of his own on Kickstarter. So you could just see the potential there. What I've done in lieu of that is created a subscription service. Back in 2020, when we were in the throes of the pandemic, we didn't know if we'd have Comic Cons again. We didn't know if conventions would come back and in what capacity. Would they be virtual, if anything? So, wanting to get my physical product into the hands of friends and fans, I created a subscription service with that thesis. Like, if cons don't come back, sign up for this. So I'll just send you my stuff directly. And the first year I was ambitious and I said, I'll send you stuff monthly. Then I kind of went to every other month. And next year I might end up going to quarterly. But I've been doing it since 2010, where toward the end of the year, and I'm approaching that season now, I'll remind folks that have signed up and I'll post on social media and stuff. If you're interested in this kind of thing, where a couple times a year for a very reasonable one-time subscription fee, you're going to get a package from me with everything I've created over those last several weeks. I would just really appreciate that opportunity to get it to you directly by paying me through Venmo and PayPal or whatever else. We're kind of skipping that piece that a lot of crowdfunding platforms take, however small in some cases that may be. The money's going directly into my pocket, and these books are going directly to you with nobody in the middle. And it's been working. I really enjoy this because it creates this kind of community around my work. Not that everybody's even here in the Valley. I mean, I send my stuff to Dean and some other friends in Brooklyn. I have friends in Florida that receive it, Portland, Iowa, Texas. So it's exciting to know that as long as this thing stays in place and I kind of have a retention model with it too, I will always have an audience, no matter what other variable kind of comes up in the world. And as long as the post office is still in operation, I guess
Yeah,
that's
for
important
sure.
too.
I mean, they're all seemingly of a piece with each other in some way. It's all really this pre-sale model, right?
Yeah,
Sort of instead of, or maybe in addition to having a product in hand and trying to sell it to you, is that you're selling sort of the trust in you that this is going to come out and you're going to enjoy it, and help me put it into your hands,
yes,
because you're going to buy it anyway. This just is a more mutually beneficial arrangement to make that happen.
absolutely. Small press used to have a stronger distribution model in the industry. Diamond wasn't the only game in town in the late 80s and early 90s. Cold Cut, Bud Plant. There were ways to get mini comics and zines and alternative press out there, but those waned in the 90s to the point now where I've begun to more confidently understand that Kickstarter has filled that vacuum. So as much as it is, hey, help me get this thing published, it's also a help me get this thing to you. So I definitely respect it for that. And people that have accomplished some large Kickstarters and Indiegogos and everything else, it's like more power to them at this point. If you're creating a model where you're getting it right, hot off the press, right into a reader's hands, man, that's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. As we come to a close here, what are you looking to, or what's on your plate? What are you doing next? And what can, fans look forward to seeing from you?
Cool. Well, I'll say this: if anybody's in the Valley, Phoenix, and you haven't seen my work, I do teach some regular classes at a used bookstore here called Bookman's. We have two locations in Phoenix and Mesa. I teach that every third Sunday of the month. So if there's anybody in the greater Phoenix metro area that listens to this podcast, first of all, you have great taste. You're listening to a great show. But then secondly, if you know any young artists that would like to come by one of these classes that I teach, we have some lessons, some structured stuff. Then we kind of free draw and just shoot the breeze too. I learned a lot about manga and anime this way. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's something that I do ongoing every third Sunday of the month, like I said, at Bookman's in Phoenix and Mesa. I also publish a regular column on a website called Nerdvana Media. That's like Nirvana, but with the D, so it's Nerdvana. It's called My Maker Mantras, and these are lessons that I've learned self-publishing since back in the days with my buddy Brent, so over the last 20 plus years. Little mantras that I kind of tell myself to motivate myself, lessons I've learned, and maybe things any artist really, not just making comics, but I kind of try to transcend and have these things applicable to anyone making art of any kind. So you could follow that posts every Saturday on Nerdvana Media. And then I'm just working on issue 53 right now. I just got back from Cleveland. My girlfriend was at a cat conference there. She is a cat rescuer and activist and educator, and she was, leading workshops at this cat conference. It was kind of the San Diego Comic-Con for cat culture. Such a thing exists. And so she was at that. And while we were in Cleveland, I was like, oh, I'm going to go to the Siegel and Schuster house. I'm going to go to Harvey Picard Park. I'm going to see where superhero and autobio comics kind of were born. And I had such a fun time seeing these things. It was so inspiring that I think issue 53 is kind of going to meld that superhero autobio vibe into a singular story that reflects the spirit of those observations and experiences. I've been thumbnailing it. I'd really like to have it done by the end of the year, and I think it'll kind of set the stage for next year's issues, which might be a little more diverse, not just superhero stuff, but maybe some autobios, some memoir, some more fantasy sci-fi, maybe some horror, some Western, which is long overdue considering, this book takes place in the Southwest. I really kind of want to broaden the horizons a little bit. So people that may be interested in something that's regional, but maybe they're not into superheroes as much. I want to take that barrier down too a little bit and say, well, here's an old school romance story. Here's something that's a little more memoir, a little more American Splendor-esque. So that's kind of my vision going into 2025. And people can find this stuff on my Instagram at Amazing AZ Comics. And there's a link tree with the Etsy store and the Nerdvana Media link for my mantra articles and everything else that I do.
And we're back. Hey, Russ, thank you for coming on the program. I really enjoyed our conversation. Love to hear how people are telling these more niche stories in different ways, finding outlets to get their work out and really making it happen, putting in the hustle and making comics. So we love to see it. We love to hear about it. And thank you for being on the program, Russ. And thank you all for listening and for viewing this episode. We have a couple more this week, so you'll want to listen up for those. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe so we keep this Dollar Bin Bandit train running. And we'll see you next issue. Peace.